Hello everyone, so I'm going to be reading A Cup of Kindness by Icypanther on AO3. This is chapter 3, by the way. Also, sorry if I'm, sound weird. I'm congested because of allergies, so yeah. And also, again, sorry if I stutter. Anyway, let's get started. Curran came out from behind the counter a few minutes later, and to Keith's surprise, 2 mugs in his hands. "May I join you?" Curran asked quietly, and while he was still smiling, it was smaller and softer than the earlier beam, and Keith realized in that instant that if he said no, Curran would leave, no questions asked. It was why he nodded his head yes. "Thank you." Curran slid into the chair across from Keith, and slid a mug topped with whipped cream to him, while a more simple one that smelled faintly of orange rested in front of him. Keith wrapped his hands around the ceramic, patterned with flowers, and the heat felt nice to the pleasant coolness of the coffee shop. "You'll have to tell me your thoughts upon it." Curran nodded his head at Keith's drink. "I'm trying out some new recipes in preparation for the winter season, and I could use some opinions outside of my staff's. That one there is toasted marshmallow." Keith didn't know what to say to that. This conversation already was not going the way he had envisioned, but that wasn't a bad thing. "My name is Curran," the man reintroduced himself. "And what name might I call you, lad?" Keith's eyes widened at the question. It wasn't what his name was. It was what he wanted to be called, in case he didn't feel comfortable sharing. Who was this person who had far more patience and kindness than any social worker and foster parent and teacher he'd ever met? Who was treating him like a person instead of a problem? It was either because he was genuinely kind or he had some other motive, as so many always did. But for now, Curran had given him no reason to withhold his name. "Keith," he said quietly, eyes lowered to his drink. "It's nice to meet you, Keith," Curran said, and without looking, Keith knew he was smiling. "And now, I must ask you one more question." Keith tensed. Here it came. He should have known it was too good to be true. "Do you prefer chicken noodle or broccoli and cheese soup?" Keith's head jerked up. What? He croaked out, regretting how stupid that must sound. But Curran only smiled. "Those are the 2 soups of the day," he explained. "Well, I had some chicken tortilla soup, too, but I'm afraid I'm all out of that one." "I don't have any money," Keith blurted out, cheeks heating even more, as of course it had to be obvious. But he didn't want to be accused, even though he didn't think Curran would. But he'd been deceived more than once before, and it was hard to trust anyone at their word, written or spoken, of stealing later. And for the first time, Curran lost his smile, although his face was still kind. "And I promised you a proper meal, did I not?" he asked gently. "Completely on me." Keith ducked his head again. Curran patiently waited for a response, but the silence didn't feel tense and heavy like it did at the agency's office. "Chicken noodle," Keith finally mumbled. "An excellent choice," Curran said, although Keith had a feeling he'd have said that no matter what he picked. It made a small smile quirk onto his lips. "And do you happen to be a grilled cheese fan, too?" Keith nodded. "Perfect," Curran said. "I'll go get that started, although it might be a few minutes, as I'm closing up the shop." Keith gave a start. I'm sorry, I didn't—" "Oh, no," Curran waved a hand at him. "It's no trouble at all. Please, make yourself at home." Keith tried not to flinch at that, and he wasn't entirely sure if he was successful. "And drink your hot chocolate. There's some puzzles and books on the shelves if you're interested, too." "Do you need any help?" Keith offered hesitantly. Cleaning was the other thing he was very good at after all, and if he helped clean, then this didn't feel completely like charity. "I thank you for the offer, but please, relax." Curran smiled at him, and Keith gave a slow nod. "And if you'll excuse me." Curran pushed his chair back, collected his mug, empty somehow, even though Keith hadn't touched his yet, and headed for the counter. Keith took a careful sip of his hot chocolate, eyes widening at the taste. It tasted like s'mores. He hadn't had a s'mores since Pop had taken him hiking on his 10th birthday, and then that Christmas. Keith's eyes stung again, and he turned his attention to anything else. The college students were in the process of gathering their papers and books, and the woman reading had already left. Keith stood up, too, and holding his mug, went to look at the bookshelves. It was quite a random collection, from children's books to young adult photo books to classic literature, and a bunch of board games and decks of cards and puzzle boxes were stacked at the bottom shelf. Keith's eyes lingered on the deck of cards, memories of playing Go Fish with Pop pressing in, before he moved on, examining the rest of the decor. It very prominently featured both oranges and fruit bowls, and mustaches, and, in a few cases, both at once. Keith held in a chuckle. As he moved towards the back of the space, the tables gave way to a small hallway that led to a bathroom. And while Keith knew he'd been dirty, he suddenly felt incredibly so. Corinne wouldn't mind if he used it, would he? It was clearly for patrons, and while Keith wasn't paying, Corinne had told him to make himself feel comfortable. Keith set his mug on the nearest table and let himself in, squinting at the bright orange walls that took up the small single-use bathroom. The squint turned into a wince and a sharp inhale as he got a look at himself in the mirror. He looked awful. It was a wonder Corinne hadn't called the police on him. The bruise was both purple and black, and moving to green, taking up Keith's entire right cheek and stretching up to wrap around his eye. His hair was matted and lank. His skin, while sunburned on his face, looked pale beneath it, and there were near bruises of exhaustion beneath his eyes. Keith could only imagine how much worse those had been yesterday. And his clothes were smudged with dirt and beyond wrinkled. Keith couldn't do anything about his clothes, but he dutifully turned the tap on the sink and lathered his hands and did what he could to scrub the dirt off his hands and face, to comb the wet fingers through his hair to get rid of the worst of the tangles. And while he still felt dirty, he felt a little better. He didn't realize, though, how long he'd been in the bathroom, as when he emerged, there was a plate and bowl sitting at his table and a tall glass of milk, and Corinne was sitting at the other spot with a copy of the same, and clearly waiting for Keith before he ate too. "Sorry," Keith whispered, flushing, but Corinne merely smiled at him. "You're looking a bit refreshed," he said instead, "and I also see you finished your hot chocolate. What did you think?" Keith slid into the opposite chair. He and Corinne, now the only ones in the store. It was good," he said. It tasted like s'mores." "Then I have been successful," Corinne grinned. "You'll have to sample my other two later, if you're feeling up for it. Peppermint bark and gingerbread." Keith didn't know how to answer that either, because Corinne made it sound like, but that was impossible. No one ever wanted Keith, and he wasn't a charity case either. He didn't need anyone's pity, so he said nothing. Corinne didn't seem perturbed by that, merely picking up his spoon and loudly taking a slurp of his soup. After a moment, Keith did the same, and just like he was expecting based on everything else he'd eaten from here, it was delicious. They ate quietly, soft strains of music playing from the radio on the front counter, but that was all right with Keith, as he really didn't know what to talk about. He couldn't remember the last time he'd had an actual conversation with someone about anything other than his behavior, how terrible and ungrateful he was, or what chores and punishments he was being assigned. Ah, that hit the spot. Corinne leaned back, several minutes later, patting his stomach. The chicken noodle was an excellent choice. Keith hadn't quite managed to finish his own dinner. Soup gone, but over half his sandwich still left. As he knew from experience, eating too much after days of nothing was not a good idea. "So, Keith," Corinne leaned forward, and Keith braced himself for the line of questions. "I like to wrap up my evenings with an engaging activity whenever possible. What do you say to a rousing game of gin rummy?" Keith blinked. "What? A card game?" It was only delaying the inevitable, where Corinne would bid him good night, show him the door, and that would be it. "But I don't know that game," Keith admitted quietly. "Would you like to learn?" Corinne asked. If you want to play." "Do you want to play?" Corinne emphasized. "You are welcome to say no, Keith." Keith's eyes widened. That he knew without a doubt was the first time someone had told him he could say no. He was never allowed to say no, to disagree, to say things they didn't like. "I don't know," he whispered instead, fingers back in his jacket cuffs. "Then how about I explain the rules and you let me know if they interest you?" Keith nodded. He could do that. After learning the rules and agreeing to try a hand, to his surprise, he found that he was actually enjoying it, playing hand after hand with the only pause coming when Corinne said he was going to fix some more drinks and wrap up Keith's unfinished sandwich, and he found himself with a mug of peppermint bark hot chocolate, while Corinne seemed to be drinking tea again. They didn't make small talk as they played, although Corinne had some rather unique phrases when he used when Keith called gin and he was trapped with a bad hand. That had made Keith smile, as they were so absorbed they had to be made up. "Goodness me," Corinne gasped as Keith dealt out the next hand. "Look at the time." Keith looked up and followed Corinne's gaze to a ticking wall clock above the counter. He paled. It was nearly 9 in the evening. He hadn't even realized how late it had gotten. He'd taken up all of Corinne's time. My, how time flies when one is having fun, Corinne chuckled, but he shot a rueful look at Keith. I do run a coffee shop, so early to bed, early to rise is how it must be. I'm sorry, Keith apologized, pushing back his chair and going to stand. I didn't mean to. His knee hit the underside of the table, and Corinne's tea mug near the edge tipped right off. The crash it made as it shattered into pieces had Keith flinching back before he lunged forward, apologies already tripping off his tongue as he knelt there, picking up the largest pieces of ceramic, pulse racing because he knew punishment always followed when he did something wrong. But sometimes, if he showed enough remorse, they didn't hurt him as much. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to. I'll clean it up, Keith babbled, hot tea burning and ceramic shards cutting his fingers as he pushed them into a pile. I'm sorry, hands, large and warm, wrapped around both of his wrists, halting him. Keith froze, trying not to tremble in the grip and wincing as Corinne's hold pressed on the bruises layered there. He didn't think Corinne was violent, but he thought that about a lot of other people. But he thought that about a lot of other people before, too. No one could be trusted. He'd been stupid to think so. Keith, Corinne's voice was soft. It's all right. It's just a mug. Keith shook his head. No, it wasn't just a mug. It was Corinne's mug, someone else's property. It's all right. Corinne squeezed his wrist gently, and Keith winced, even though he didn't think that hadn't been the intention. I promise, lad. No harm done. Keith looked up. Corinne was crouched down in front of him, eyes gentle, and while there was a small smile on his face, as Keith met his eyes, his face looked sad, and the cold fear that had overtaken him was replaced with hot embarrassment, and Keith ducked his head. Corinne released his wrist, and Keith did not imagine the sharp intake of breath as Corinne no doubt caught sight of the bruise before Keith yanked his jacket sleeve back down. He said nothing, though, merely stood up and said, I shall fetch a broom. Would you pick up the cards, please? Keith didn't dare argue and nodded, shakily standing. Corinne returned not even a minute later with a roll of paper towels and a broom and a dustpan, and as Keith started forward, Corinne held up a hand and Keith froze. It felt wrong to watch someone else cleaning up a mess Keith had made. There, Corinne said, sweeping the entire mess into the dustpan and tossing it into the garbage can next to the front counter. And with that taken care of, he turned back to Keith, and those sort of jewel-like eyes were appraising, sharp. Those eyes saw a lot more than Corinne's genial manner would let on, and Keith faintly wondered what he was thinking. I hope I'm not too blunt in asking this, Corinne said, and Keith immediately tensed. But where do you plan to spend the rest of the evening, Keith? Keith offered a small shrug to that, feeling his cheeks flush at how obvious it was he had nowhere to go. Then, if you're not opposed to it, I would like to offer you— I don't need your pity, Keith snapped, hands curling into fists to the sides, and color rising fast to his face, and he hated that he welcomed the anger, because at least if he was angry, he wasn't scared. He knew he looked pathetic. He knew Corinne had seen the bruises. He was making his own guesses, and how Keith was no longer just a person, but a person who needed help, and something far more than just a meal. Like a child who needed protecting. Keith wasn't like that. He made his own way here. He'd survived this long. No one had cared before. He didn't need anyone to start now, even if he really, really did. No, Corinne said quietly, not raising to Keith's anger. You do not. But his eyes bored into Keith's. I do think you deserve a bit of kindness. And just like that, Keith felt all the anger whoosh out. What? Kindness? Please. Corinne spread his hands. I do not wish to offend you, and if you truly do not wish it, then you can always say no, and you will still be welcome. But if you had no planned lodgings this evening, I wish to invite you to spend the night here. Keith remained rigid, hands trembling, although no longer with anger at his sides. He didn't know Corinne, not really. He might play a nice coffee shop on her, but he could be something else. For all Keith knew, he was a serial killer, even as he squashed the thought immediately as that was ridiculous. Kindness never came for free. He'd learned that. Not anymore. It always had a hidden cost. But he could could see none here, and that scared him. Because those that hid their true intentions, how cruel they really were, could put on masks to fool the world. They are the most terrifying people of all. Why? He whispered quietly. Because I would like to, Corinne said just as quietly. But as always, the choice is yours, Keith. Keith shifted on his feet. No one ever gave him a choice. They told him where he was going, what he was going to do, what they were going to do to him, and he had no say, and if he tried, they'd just punished and hurt him more. But here, what he wouldn't give to spend a night with a roof over his head, no fear of someone finding him and hurting him in the parks or turning him in, to wake up without being in pain from the uncomfortable position he'd wedged himself into, to feel safe. He hadn't felt safe in so long, and he realized that he'd felt safe here over dinner, playing the card game, and maybe he could give it a chance. It's not like it could be any worse, right? Okay, he whispered, staring at his feet. If it's not too much trouble. It's no trouble at all, Corinne smiled at him. My apartment is just above the shop, but we'll sit you up here, all right? I assume the couch is rather comfortable, as I have had more than one patron doze off on it. Keith nodded. He'd prefer that, as going into Corinne's private quarters felt it was too much. Very good. If you'll hang on just a tick, I'll go fetch some blankets. You go ahead and find a pillow that suits you. Corinne entered the kitchen to where no doubt the staircase was located, and Keith busied himself picking out one of the many throw pillows and clutching his chosen one, a black and orange one with a giant embroidered mustache on it, to his chest as he perched on the edge of the couch that was situated by the armchairs. The clock above the counter ticked. The radio continued to play. Corinne returned several minutes later, 2 quilts in his arms and a small box atop that. Here we are, he said. Here we are. He set the blankets down on the opposite end of the couch Keith had sat on. Now, fair warning, the lights above the counter remain on as they are emergency lights, but they are not too bright. Clean cups are on the counter by the sink if you would like to get anything to drink. Water, milk, and I think some orange juice are in the fridge. The front door is locked, but if you'd like to leave, just give it a push and it'll lock again behind you. My running staff will be arriving around 5:30 a.m., so while I do apologize for the early hour, I'll come to rouse you around 5 if you're not already awake. Any questions? Keith mutely shook his head, overwhelmed, but in a good way. But there was one thing he did want to say. He clutched the pillow tighter, finding it hard to meet Corinne's eyes. Thank you for this. You're most welcome, dear boy. Corinne said gently. Good night, Keith, and pleasant dreams. Good night, Keith whispered. Corinne smiled at him and returned to the kitchen. A flip of the light switch later did plunge the shop into darkness, and the radio went silent, but it was still bright enough for Keith to make his way to the bathroom and to see what was in the box atop the blankets. He pulled the flaps open, not quite sure what Corinne would have given him. A toothbrush, still in its wrapper, and a small tube of toothpaste greeted him, along with a washcloth, a bar of soap, a box of Band-Aids, and antiseptic cream, and at the very bottom, a long-sleeve shirt in burnt orange, and a pair of drawstring pants in orange plaid that were no doubt Corinne's. Keith's eyes stung. As he changed into them in the privacy of the bathroom, they were too big, as he expected, but they were clean and soft and warm, just as a gesture behind them. Keith crawled into the couch a few minutes later, stomach full, breath fresh, and the worst of the grime scrubbed off from a quick impromptu wash. A few Band-Aids now sporting on some scratches and cuts, and comfortable beyond anything he'd known in a long, long time. He shuddered out of breath, clutching another pillow, this one in the shape of a mustache, in his arms. The only sound besides his own breathing was the soft ticking of the clock. Keith let out another breath. He was safe here. No one was going to hurt him here. His eyes fluttered closed, and Keith was asleep just before the clock struck 9.